I knew the axe was coming the second Julian Croft leaned on my cubicle wall like he owned the building. He was 34 years old, wore a slick gray suit, and had teeth so white they looked fake. He leaned in, looked at my dog-eared binder, and said, "Harvey, buddy, your old-school handshake diplomacy is cute. But we are moving Vanguard Solutions to a scalable model. In corporate speak, that meant I was fired." 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a glass conference room with Evelyn Gale, the HR director. She slid a severance folder across the table with a smile that was too bright, like she was handing me a birthday card. My security badge was deactivated before I even finished signing the exit forms. To soften the blow, they handed me a black polyester tote bag with the Vanguard logo printed on the front, as if a cheap piece of corporate swag could cover up the fact that they were gutting my entire department. I am Harvey Vance, 55 years old, and I had spent the last 15 years building the enterprise sales division from nothing. As I walked out, I held that dog-eared binder tight. Inside it were 15 years of relationship maps, renewal schedules, and the proprietary Lighthouse client management framework I had developed long before I ever set foot in this building. That binder was my life's work, and Julian had just called it replaceable. He did not know that 3 of our biggest accounts, the whales that kept the lights on at Vanguard, had key person riders in their contracts: Apex Logistics, Beacon Corp, and Summit Enterprise. Their contracts clearly stated that if I was no longer their account manager, they had the right to terminate their agreements for convenience immediately. Julian did not bother to check the contracts. His buzzword-filled brain thought automated email chains and pre-recorded webinars could replace a 6 a.m. coffee with a client whose business I had saved twice. I sat in my car, looking at the cheap tote bag, and smiled. In my copy of the employment agreement, right under Section 12C, there was a clause I fought for years ago. It was my insurance policy. If Vanguard ever terminated me without cause, my non-compete and non-solicit agreements regarding my client list would instantly dissolve. And if they ever tried to force me to hand over my Lighthouse methodology, it would trigger a mandatory buyout. Silence is not surrender. It is just preparation. I drove home, hung my old wall calendar in my new office, and started counting down the days. I knew exactly how Julian would handle my departure. He would not call the clients. He would send them a mass email and a glossy PDF. Sure enough, 2 days later, my friend Toby Bell from operations called me. Toby told me Julian had already sent a generic email to my accounts. No personal calls, no transition plan, just a link to a recorded webinar with bad lighting. Nigel, the procurement director at Apex Logistics, was the first to react. Nigel did not call Julian. He went straight to the contract's inbox. He sent a formal notice citing the key person departure, terminating their contract effective immediately. That single account brought in $2.4 million in annual revenue. It was more than Julian's entire department budget. I had spent 7 years building that relationship. I flew out for dinners, sat through long logistics meetings, and even helped them find a new carrier when their main partner went bankrupt. And Julian lost it in 48 hours. I did not feel angry. I felt a quiet, cold satisfaction. I went to the kitchen and baked a peach bourbon pie. I wrote cost of doing business and whipped cream across the top, took a photo, and saved it on my phone. The real disaster was just starting for Vanguard, and they had no idea that they had handed me the match to burn their house down. It did not take long for the initial silence from the front office to turn into a low, anxious hum. Nigel's termination notice for Apex Logistics had hit Vanguard Solutions like a lead pipe to the jaw. But Julian Croft was still trying to spin it. Toby Bell, my operations friend who was sitting in the war room, texted me that Julian had explained the loss to the CEO as a standard adjustment period. He told them that some client churn is normal during leadership transitions. That is what amateurs say when they lose a customer they thought was captured. Professionals call it a slow bleed. And this was just the first cut. 9 days after Apex Logistics walked away, the second blow landed. Marshall, the CFO at Beacon Corp, sent in their formal termination letter. No emotion, no fluff. Just a simple paragraph stating that pursuant to Section 11B of their commercial agreement, they were terminating effective immediately due to the key person change. That account had been my baby since the ink dried on their first contract 8 years ago. I had earned Marshall's trust during the 2009 economic downturn. I did not send him generic brochures. I sent him a care package of his favorite bourbon and the exact cigars he smoked at his wedding, along with a revised payment schedule that kept his department afloat when his board was ready to freeze all vendor spending. Now, that entire relationship and a $1, $8 million annual revenue stream vanished into the legal ether with a single click of his mouse. Julian's automated emails were not just failing, they were actively insulting the clients. These corporate buyers had spent years working with me because they wanted a human being who understood their supply chain, not a slick 34-year-old VP who sent them automated check-ins from a template. Summit Enterprise did not even wait for their formal renewal date. 4 days after Beacon Corp pulled out, Jeffrey, the VP of Procurement at Summit, sent their termination notice. The email landed in the General Counsel's inbox at 11:45 a.m. just before lunch. Same recited, same section referenced, same result. Another $3 million account gone. In less than 2 weeks, Vanguard Solutions had lost $7.2 million in annual revenue. Julian's entire tenure was now defined by a 30% collapse in the company's enterprise division, and all he had to show for it was a webinar replay that nobody watched past slide 4. Inside the building, it was absolute chaos. Toby described it as watching a kitchen catch fire, while the head chef stands in the smoke, insisting that the smell of burning plastic is actually a new seasoning. The executive leadership ordered a rapid response plan, which was corporate code for endless meetings, where everyone argued about the wording of emails instead of addressing the core issue. The clients were not buying Vanguard's software. They were buying my execution. That is when the comedy really started. The CEO's executive assistant, a woman who had never once spoken to me in my 15 years at the company, sent an email with a subject line that read, "Need your retention scripts ASAP. No introduction. No hope you are doing well." Just a blunt instruction to drop everything and hand over my proprietary Lighthouse materials so they could give them to Julian's junior account managers. They had no idea that those scripts and relationship playbooks were not company property. Every year, without fail, I licensed the Lighthouse methodology to Vanguard for 12 months at a negotiated rate. That rate was tucked away in a special services addendum in my employment contract. It had been signed off by the previous general counsel, a brilliant man who actually read agreements before signing them. The day Julian walked me out of the building was the exact day that annual license expired. I did not respond to the assistant's email. Instead, I went to my home office, opened my storage box, and spread out the paperwork. I had every signed Lighthouse license addendum going back a decade, all marked as employee-originated methodology, licensed, not assigned. I had 10 years of performance reviews where the company praised my proprietary relationship framework for resulting in 98% client retention and 40% upsell rates. They had literally put the word proprietary in my reviews, assuming it meant company property. They were about to learn the difference between copyright ownership and a temporary lease. Then my phone lit up. The caller ID showed the main office number. I let it ring for a few seconds before picking up. Before I could even say hello, Alistair Thorne's voice barked through the speaker. "Harvey," he said, his tone loaded with gravel and too much coffee. "Under your contract, you are required to return all company materials immediately. We need the Lighthouse scripts. If you do not hand them over by tomorrow morning, I will have our legal team file an injunction to compel performance." He sounded like a man who had been awake for 48 hours, suddenly realizing he had bet the company's future on the wrong horse. I let him talk. I let him think he was dictating the terms. I did not correct him about the license, and I did not mention that Section 12C was sitting on my desk, highlighted in bright yellow ink. "Fine. Alistair," I said, keeping my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "If you want to talk about the contract, let's read it together." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. It was not confusion. It was the faint, cold realization of an executive who has just realized the ice he is standing on is much thinner than he thought. The calendar invite came through that same afternoon, titled Emergency Strategy Session. Attendance was marked as mandatory. I replied within 2 minutes with a single sentence. "Please confirm that General Counsel Simon Foster will be present." I had no intention of stepping into a room full of panicked executives without a lawyer whose job was to read the exact words I was about to lay on the table. The next morning, I dressed like a man who was going to a casual brunch but intended to leave with a settlement. I wore a crisp white cotton shirt, a tailored navy blazer, and no jewelry except my gold wedding band. I carried two things: a slim leather folio containing 3 pristine copies of my employment contract and a separate red folder marked Lighthouse License Agreements Complete. The folio was for show. The folder was the loaded weapon. When I walked into the Vanguard boardroom on the 14th floor, the air was freezing. The HVAC system always seems to run a few degrees colder in rooms where people make terrible decisions they hope to blame on someone else. Alistair Thorne was already at the head of the table. His tie was slightly crooked, and he was drinking coffee from a cheap paper cup instead of his usual custom tumbler. Small details, but they told me everything. He was vibrating with stress. Julian Croft sat to his right, leaning back in a leather chair with a smirk that was meant to project control. To Julian, this meeting was just a formality, a quick session where they would bark a few threats, and I would hand over the scripts to save my reputation. Evelyn Gale, the HR director, was sitting near the corner, nervously shuffling a stack of papers she did not need. Simon Foster, the general counsel, sat quietly with his yellow notepad, looking at me with a neutral expression. Alistair opened the meeting by slamming his hand onto the mahogany table. He did not speak. He boomed. He threw out terms like material breach, fiduciary duty, and immediate operational necessity. He claimed my refusal to hand over the client relationship scripts was putting Vanguard's core business in jeopardy. Julian nodded along, looking like a junior lawyer trying to impress his boss. When Alistair paused to take a breath, I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I slowly unzipped my leather folio, took out the 3 copies of my employment agreement, and slid one toward Alistair, one toward Simon Foster, and one toward Evelyn Gale. "I think we should read the agreement together," I said quietly. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small sheet of yellow sticky flags, and placed one on Section 12C and another on Exhibit D. Simon Foster adjusted his glasses and leaned over the document. At first, his eyes scanned the page quickly, with the practiced speed of a corporate attorney who thinks he knows what is coming. But after a few seconds, the pen he had been tapping on his notepad went completely still. His lips moved slightly, reading the same paragraph twice as if he was trying to make sure he was not hallucinating the words. He glanced from Section 12C to Exhibit D, then looked up at me. His face was no longer neutral. It was pale. Julian Croft's smirk froze. He leaned forward, trying to read his boss's face, but Simon was too busy staring at the contract. I let the silence build. In a room full of shouting executives, the person who speaks the quietest is the one who controls the air. "I would like to ensure everyone in this room understands what we are looking at," I said, looking directly at Alistair. Section 12C was negotiated 3 years ago after previous management tried to reassign my accounts without credit. It outlines the specific penalty clauses if Vanguard terminates my employment without cause and then attempts to compel my services. I tapped my finger on Exhibit D, and Exhibit D lists the 3 accounts defined as employee-originated: Apex Logistics, Beacon Corp, and Summit Enterprise. The exact accounts you have been trying to transition using my work. Alistair leaned back, crossing his arms. He looked at Simon. "Simon," he said, "what is he talking about? This is just standard boilerplate language." Simon Foster did not look at Alistair. He kept his eyes glued to the paper, his fingers trace reading the text. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet, very deliberate. "It is not boilerplate, Alistair," Simon said. He read the text aloud for the room. "Upon termination without cause, all non-compete and non-solicitation covenants dissolve immediately with respect to employee-originated accounts listed in Exhibit D." He paused, looking at Julian, then back to the CEO. "And any attempt to compel service post-termination triggers a mandatory buyout equal to 2.5 times the trailing 12-month revenue of those accounts." The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Julian's jaw dropped. The CFO, Dominic Ward, who had just walked in and sat down at the far end of the table, looked like he had just swallowed a stone. Simon looked up at Alistair. "We terminated Harvey Vance without cause 12 days ago," he said. And then we sent him a written demand to hand over his proprietary methodology to train Julian's team. Alistair's face went from red to gray. The trap had sprung, and the lawyer had just walked them right into it. Simon Foster looked at Dominic Ward, the CFO, who was staring at his notepad like it had caught fire. "Dominic," Simon said, his voice flat, "pull the trailing 12-month revenue for Apex Logistics, Beacon Corp, and Summit Enterprise now." Dominic did not even look at Alistair for approval. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke in hushed, urgent tones to a junior analyst. 5 minutes later, Dominic's laptop screen lit up. He stared at the spreadsheet, his face going completely blank. "What is the number, Dominic?" Alistair demanded. Dominic cleared his throat twice. "The trailing 12-month revenue for those three accounts is $7.2 million, he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Multiplied by 2. 5. The contract buyout under Section 12C is exactly $18 million. Alistair looked like he had been hit with a bucket of ice water. $18 million. That was more than the company's entire profit margin for the last 2 quarters. But that was only the first envelope of pain. I opened my red folder and drew out the Lighthouse license agreements. I slid them across the table toward Simon Foster. "That is the intellectual property license," I said. "Vanguard Solutions' license to use the Lighthouse client management scripts expired the exact hour I was walked out of the building. We did not sign an extension, and we did not pay a renewal fee." One of the operations managers sitting at the far end of the table shrank back in his chair. We actually used Harvey's onboarding templates last week for the new sales reps," he muttered, looking at the floor. "Julian told us it was company property." Alistair's general counsel groaned, rubbing his temples. I drew one more sheet of paper from my folder. It was a printed log of system access. "I set up automatic notifications on my shared folder before I left," I said softly. "Here is the login history. 42 separate instances of Julian's managers downloading, copying, and distributing the Lighthouse templates after my termination date, complete with IP addresses, employee IDs, and timestamps. Under federal copyright law, specifically Title 17, Section 504 of the United States Code, this constitutes willful infringement. Since you knew the license had expired, we are looking at statutory damages of up to $150,000 per violation, plus full fee shifting." Simon Foster closed his eyes. He did not need to run the math. Willful copyright infringement, fully documented with system logs, was a legal death sentence. Julian Croft finally found his voice, but it came out too high and too fast. "This is extortion," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "The Lighthouse templates were developed while you were employed here. They belong to Vanguard." Simon Foster opened his eyes, turned to Julian, and said, "Shut up, Julian." He did not say it in a professional tone. He said it with the raw exhaustion of a man who was watching his company sink because of one man's arrogance. Simon pointed to Exhibit D on the contract. "It is right here, Julian, licensed annually by mutual agreement. Ownership remains with the employee. It is not ours." I let the silence hang for a moment, enjoying the sight of Julian's face turning the color of wet cement. Then, I reached into my leather folio and laid 2 white envelopes on the mahogany table. "A and option B," I said, sliding them side by side. "A is simple," I explained. "You retain me as an independent consultant to manage the transition of the 3 accounts. My rate is $900 an hour, with a 200-hour minimum, payable in advance. No net 30 payment terms. Julian Croft resigns, effective today, with no severance. Vanguard issues a formal apology for role misclassification, and you reinstate the Lighthouse license for 12 months at triple the previous rate, paid today." Alistair stared at the envelope labeled Option A. "And Option B?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Option B is that I walk out of this room," I said. "I have already signed an employment agreement with Pinnacle Group, your main competitor. They have already drafted contract transition paperwork for Apex Logistics, Beacon Corp, and Summit Enterprise. Because my non-compete is dissolved, those clients are coming with me. Vanguard wires the $18 million buyout amount, plus the copyright infringement damages to my bank account by Friday at 5 p.m. I stood up, leaving the 2 envelopes on the table. "The choice is yours, gentlemen," I said, adjusting my navy blazer. "But the clock is already ticking." I stood up, zipped my leather folio, and walked toward the boardroom door. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody barked any more threats. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper as Simon Foster pulled the access logs closer, his pen scribbling furious calculations in the margin of his notepad. He was adding up the numbers, and they were brutal. The $18 million contract buyout was just the baseline. When you added the statutory damages for 42 documented instances of willful copyright infringement at $150,000 per violation, that was another $6.3 million. Vanguard Solutions was looking at a total liability of more than $24.3 million, not including my legal fees, which they would be forced to pay under the fee-shifting clause. As I opened the heavy glass door, I looked back one last time. Alistair Thorne was staring at the invoice I had left on the table as if it were a ticking bomb. Evelyn Gale was looking down at her hands, her face flushed with the realization that she had approved my firing without ever consulting legal or checking Exhibit D. And Julian Croft was slumped in his ergonomic chair, the arrogance completely drained from his face, looking like a teenager who had just wrecked his father's favorite car. I walked out of the executive suite, down the long corridor, and stepped into the elevator. When the doors slid shut, I let out a long, quiet breath. For 15 years, I had given Vanguard my life. I had worked late nights, missed family dinners, and flown across the country to fix problems that were not mine. All I had ever wanted was respect, a simple acknowledgement that the relationships I built were the foundation of their business. They thought they could automate my work, call me replaceable, and keep the fruits of my labor for free. They were about to learn that when you treat people like line items, they will treat you like an unpaid invoice. In the lobby, the security guard, Carl, gave me a warm nod. "Have a good evening, Mr. Vance," he said. "You too, Carl," I replied, smiling. "Take care of yourself." I walked out into the cool evening air, got into my car, and drove straight to the office of Pinnacle Group, located just 3 blocks away. Their CEO, a smart, practical man who had been trying to recruit me for 5 years, was waiting in his office. When I walked in, he did not hand me a cheap polyester tote bag. He poured 2 glasses of scotch and slid a signed contract across the desk. It was an executive partner position, with a base salary that matched my old pay, a 15% equity stake, and complete control over my relationship framework. The transition documents for Apex Logistics, Beacon Corp., and Summit Enterprise were already drafted and lying next to the contract. I signed the agreement, shook his hand, and went home to sleep better than I had in 15 years. The next morning, my phone began to buzz early. It was Nigel from Apex Logistics. "Harvey," he said, his voice warm. "We just received a panicked email from some junior account manager at Vanguard trying to schedule a meeting. I told them we are already transitioning our files to Pinnacle. I assume you are settled in?" "I am, Nigel," I said. "I will see you for our usual coffee on Tuesday morning." "Perfect," Nigel replied. "I will bring the donuts." An hour later, Marshall from Beacon Corp called. He laughed when I told him about the boardroom meeting. "Harvey," he said, "Alistair Thorne actually called our CEO last night trying to beg us to stay. He offered us a 20% discount on their software." I told him we do not buy software. We buy results, and our results walk on 2 feet. We are signing the Pinnacle contract today. By Friday afternoon, the transition was complete. All 3 of my whales had signed agreements with Pinnacle Group, bringing $7.2 million in annual revenue with them. At 4:45 p.m. on Friday, I sat in my new office on the 20th floor of the Pinnacle building. I opened my personal laptop and logged into my bank account. At 4:52 p.m., the pending transaction notification popped up. A wire transfer from Vanguard Solutions in the amount of $24.3 million had cleared. Simon Foster had obviously sat the board down and explained that fighting this in federal court would only lead to a public disaster, a shareholder lawsuit, and an inevitable loss. They chose the quiet, expensive exit. Toby Bell texted me a few minutes later with the internal gossip. Alistair Thorne had called an all-hands meeting at 4:30 p.m. He tried to explain the massive drop in enterprise revenue as a strategic restructuring. But the employees were not buying it. Everyone knew the truth. Julian Croft had been escorted from the building by security just an hour earlier. He was carrying the same black polyester tote bag they had given me, containing his personal belongings and his faked white teeth. I closed my laptop, stood up, and looked out the window at the city skyline. Bridges are beautiful when they burn, especially when they light the path to your next destination. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit them.